In today's video, I am going to be showing you guys a general introduction to the React library. React is a library for building user interfaces, and we're going to be learning that in this video by building an actual real-life project that you can share with your friends and family by the end of this video. This tutorial is excellent for beginners because I'll show you how to set up your development environment, how to create a boilerplate React project, the different files that it contains, how React works, and how we can create this stunning application by the end of our tutorial, which is going to allow you to basically pull information regarding the weather of different cities throughout the world. So for now, if I come to the running version of our application within our browser, you can see that it's displaying to me the current weather that's within London. So it's 7 degrees Celsius there. There's a 71% chance for cloudiness. 3 meters per second is the actual speed of the wind, and precipitation is at 88%. If I want to check for another city, let's just say, for example, Philadelphia, and I press enter, it's going to go ahead, pull the information for me, and then at the bottom I'll also be shown a history of the previous searches I've made for the different cities for which I wanted to view the weather. So now that you have a good understanding of what we're going to be building, let's actually take a look at all of the prerequisites to getting our development environment set up so that we can begin React development. The first thing that you have to do is make sure that you have the Node.js runtime installed on your system, and this is basically going to allow you to run JavaScript code on your system. So to install Node.js, what you can do is come onto the website, which is nodejs.org, and then again, links to all of the resources that I mentioned within this video, as well as a link to the source code, can be found in the description below, so feel free to take a look at it if you're confused at any point. Once you're on nodejs.org, basically download the binary from here, install it on your system, and Node.js is supported for all major operating systems, so you don't have to worry about which operating system you have. Once you have Node installed, to verify if it's installed correctly or not, what you can do is either open up Terminal if you're on Mac OS or PowerShell on Windows, and then basically type in the following command, which is node-version. And if you see an output similar to mine, the version number might be different, and that pretty much means that Node was installed successfully. You can also do npm-version, and npm stands for Node Package Manager. And if I press enter, you can see that I see that the version for it is 10.2.4. So now that this is done, this is pretty much all we had to do in terms of the actual setup. So the next thing that we're going to be taking a look at is how do we initialize a boilerplate React project. So before I do that, I just want to let you know that React is a library, it's not a framework, and it's used for building user interfaces. The only two things that React is concerned with is one, how the actual UI of your application looks like, and then two is reacting to the actual state changes and then re-rendering the UI. And another thing I want to let you know is that there are 1,000,001 ways in which you can actually initialize an empty React project. You can use Weed, you can use npx create React app, and as you progress through your journey of becoming a proficient React developer, you are going to basically adopt your way of creating a boilerplate React project. But to keep things simple, what we're going to be doing is using the npx create React app command. So now let's take a look at how to create the actual project. So to create the project, what you can do is actually come to a website called createreactapp.dev, as you can see, and then you can click on the Get Started section here, and all you have to do is basically copy this command, which is npx create React app. And before you run this command, make sure that you're within a folder on your system where you'd like to keep the actual source code for your React project. So what I'd like to do is keep the code on a folder on my desktop called development. So what I'll do is firstly change directory. So basically change directory into the desktop folder and then go to development. And here what I'm going to be doing is then basically running the command, which is npx create-react-app, and the name of my application, which in this case is going to be weather-mania, like so, and pressing enter. This is going to go ahead, run the actual command for me, install all of the packages that need to be installed, such as React, React DOM, React scripts, initialize the empty React project for me, and also give me a development server, which I can use during the development process to make my developer experience much nicer. So I'm going to wait for this to complete, and then we will resume the video. Welcome back, everybody. So as you can see that the process is now completed, and at the very bottom we can see that we are being suggested that we can change into the directory project that we had just created, and then run the npm start command to basically start the development server and see our application running on our browser. But before I do this, what I'd like to do is basically close down Terminal and open up the project that I just created within Visual Studio Code, which is my code editor of choice. If you do not know what Visual Studio Code is, it's basically a code editor, and it's going to make our developer experience much nicer when we use this to basically interact with our React project and extend it. If you want to download it, I'll leave a link down in the description below as to the link of this website, but you can come to code.visualstudio.com and then download the stable build for your operating system, and that's all you basically have to do. Once that is done, what I'm going to be doing is basically first navigating to the folder within my system where I have the project. So in my case, that's going to be within the development folder, and then just finding where I have that folder and dragging and dropping that into Visual Studio Code. And that's pretty much all we had to do. So now with this, then I can close down any of the folders that we had open. I can close down terminal since we do not need that. And I can basically increase the size so that it's easier for you guys to see what's going on. So if you open up the project in Visual Studio Code, you're going to see that we have a bunch of different folders. We have a couple of different files within the root of our project. And this is the basic boilerplate React project that npx create React creates. So I'm going to take you through what all of these files are and just give you a general introduction to them. And if we need to get deeper into them, we'll do that as we progress throughout the tutorial. So the first folder that you can see is node_modules, and this basically has code that pertains to external packages that we've installed using the Node Package Manager. The public folder basically contains all of the static files for our project. So for example, here you can see that the index.html file exists here, and this is basically the file that is served to the user as soon as they first navigate to the URL where our project or website is running. So for now, you don't have to worry much about what the public folder does, but for now, just understand that this is a folder that contains the static assets for our websites, and this is basically stuff that's directly copied from the public folder into our build folder when we actually build our application without going through an actual bundler such as Webpack. Moving onwards, we have the source folder, and as the name suggests, the source folder basically contains all of the source code for our React application, and that's pretty much it. And then after that, we have the .gitignore file. So this file is basically used by the Git version control system to determine which files it needs to ignore and not track changes for. Then we have the package.json file, which basically defines different metadata for our project, such as the dependencies for this project, the version name, and things like that. And finally, we have a readme.md file, which is basically used to input information into it regarding important things that we might need to know about our project, such as the getting started guide and things like that. So that's pretty much a good introduction to what all of these different folders and files are. The next thing that we can do is actually see how we can run this newly created React application and then browse it on our browser. So to do that, what you can do is basically open up a new terminal instance within Visual Studio Code and make sure that you're within the root of your project. And once you have made that sure, all you have to do is basically run the command npm run start. That's pretty much it. Press enter, and this is going to spin up the development server and then start running the React application, as you can see. And it's going to give you two outputs for where you can actually navigate to within your web browser to actually interact with the application. So it's either localhost running on port 3000 or the actual IP address on your network, which is 192.168.0.1.3. It might differ for you, but you can come to any of these links, and there you go. The React application, as you can see, is now running on the web browser. So one cool thing that I want to show you and why a development server is important is because it makes our development experience much nicer. If I come to the source folder and I come to, for example, let's just say app.js, and I come to the point where it says learn React, if I change this to learn React with Hussein and just save my file, it's automatically going to detect these changes. It's going to rebuild my actual project, and then the changes are actually going to be reflected on the actual web browser. So as you can see, now it tells me that it says learn React with Hussein. So that's one of the beautiful things for using a development server. And this is already coupled with our project when we create our project using npx create React app. So now that this is done, let's actually move forwards and let's do this. Let's delete all of these different files that we have within our source folder, and let's reduce them to the bare minimum so that it's easier for us to understand what's going on, and then we can kind of build our application from there. So since we're not going to be implementing any tests within our project today, I'm going to delete the setup test.js file. So just quickly going to delete this. Besides this, I'm also going to delete the report web vitals file, so I'll delete that as well. We're not going to be using the logo, so let's delete it as well. For the index.css file, let's keep that, but just remove all of the content from it, like so. Then what I'll do is that I'll come to the app.test.js file and I'll delete this as well since we do not need it. And for the app.css file, let's delete that as well. And finally, I can just go through the app.js file and make sure that I'm not importing anything that I've deleted. So I'm importing the logo here. Let's just remove that. And then for this functional component, which is app, and I'll come to what components are later on, what I can do is basically modify the markup that's being returned for now and make sure that I just return a div with a class of app. But besides that, remove all of the content that's within this div just to make sure that I get no errors. And now that this is done, I can come to the index.css file, make sure there's nothing there, index.js, and within index.js, I can just remove all of the stuff that I just deleted. So we can remove the call to the function report web vitals, like so. We can also remove import for anything else, and I believe everything else is fine. So let's do command save. Let's go back to our application. Let's see what's going on. It's telling me that it can't resolve app.css. So let me go to the app.js file and remove the import for app.css as well. And there we have it. Now our application has built successfully, and just we are seeing a blank screen on the web browser, and that's perfectly fine. So the next thing that I want to discuss now is how does React know where it needs to mount itself within the actual HTML file that gets returned to the user, and how does it work? So firstly, let's do this. Let's go to the public folder and let's see that we have an index.html file. When our user navigates to a particular URL where our React application is being hosted, they are given this index.html file plus some bundled JavaScript code and some other assets that we might have bundled with the actual project. But for now, the only concern we should have is that the user gets an index.html file and then some bundled JavaScript code. The index.html file is displayed by the browser, and it basically has HTML within it, which is a markup language used to define the structure of a web page. There is a very specific div here within the body element of our index.html, which has the ID of root. When the actual JavaScript bundle code that comes with our application is ran, and as you can see in index.js, the first thing that we do is try to find the element with the ID of root from the index.html file, and then basically use that to render our React UI within it. And that's what's basically happening here. So we get access to the element which has an ID of root, and then we use react dom.createRoot to basically create the root of our React application. And then from there, we basically use the root.render function to inject our React application into that specific div. It could have been anything else, but usually a div with the ID of root is the de facto way things get done. And then as you can see within the render function, we have the react.strict_mode component, and the child for that is the app component that comes from our app.js file. So the logical next question that you might have now is, what are these components? What's react.strict_mode? What's app? So let's firstly discuss what components are, and then I'll come to what react.strict_mode specifically is and what the app component here is as well. Components are basically the fundamental building blocks that are used to build React applications. There are components that are already present within React, such as react.strict_mode, and then there are components that we create during the development process. We use components to make sure that our application is composable, and they can be brought together in different ways to create the final UI for our application. A good way to think about components is as follows. If we come to the tesla.com website, you can see that the actual website has a navigation bar at the top. Then it has some actual pictures and content regarding the actual stuff that needs to be displayed on the home page. And at the very bottom, we have this footer. We can come to the button, click on shop now, and it's going to take us to the actual shop.tesla.com website. So you can basically see that the website is built logically of different components. And this is exactly what components allow us to do within React. For example, you can think of the navigation bar at the top as one component. You can think of this video scrolling background that you can see as another component. You can think of as the footer at the bottom as another component, and components can be as big as we want them to be and as small as we want them to be. For example, this button can be a component as well. And then basically we compose these components together to build the final UI for the Tesla website or our React application. And that's everything that you need to know for components as of now. So now that you have a good understanding of what components are, the next thing that I'm going to be discussing is what react.strict_mode is. So react.strict_mode is a special component that we can basically wrap our application with, and it's going to make sure that if during the development process we make any mistakes, that those mistakes are picked up and errors are displayed to us so that we can fix our problems. And that's just what react.strict_mode component does. The app component here is basically a component that's being returned from the app.js file, as you can see here, and it's being defined here. What you need to understand about components is that they are reusable bits of code that we can use at different places within our application, and they return markup in the form of JSX, and JSX just stands for JavaScript XML. JSX isn't necessary. You can also use functions such as create element that are supported by React, but it gets very difficult to define your UI by using the create element function. So what we usually do to define the UI of our application is just return JSX, and then JSX is basically JavaScript coupled with HTML. And the fundamental thing that you should know about JSX is that it's much stricter than JavaScript. That's one thing. And when we return JSX from an actual component, it can only have one parent element being returned. So for example, as you can see that here I'm returning a div. If, for example, instead of a div after the div, I also say that I want to return an h1 element, and I say hello here and do command save, due to us using the react.strict mode component, it's going to show me an error on the web browser, as well as because of using ESLint within the terminal as well, letting me know that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And what this is trying to tell you is that components should return only a single parent element from the JSX that they've defined. So to fix this, what you can do is either take this h1 tag and place that within the div like so, and then do command save, and then all of the errors should be fixed and you can see hello. Or if you don't want to do that and your UI for your application specifically states that after the div you have this h1 tag, then you can use something known as a React fragment to basically wrap these elements within them like so, and this should fix the issue for you, and these React fragments will be ignored in the final HTML that gets outputted to the browser. So now that we have a somewhat decent understanding of what components are, the last thing that I'd like to tell you about components is that there are two ways to define components within React. The first are class-based components and the other is function-based components. This tutorial is going to focus on function-based components, and they were introduced in React 16, I believe. And the industry now, or most of the new React projects that are being created, are moving towards the function-based components approach. And basically that's the thing that you should learn first if you are a new React developer. Once you have more experience with React, I would recommend that you also take a look at how to work with class-based components, but they are not at all necessary to become a React developer and become proficient in React in this year or for the coming future. So we're going to be focusing on function-based components. Now that we have a good understanding of components, the next thing that I'd like to talk about is what we're going to be doing while we're building our project to style our application. We can write our own CSS, or we can use different component libraries, which there are a ton of. But what I've decided to do in this tutorial is basically use my de facto CSS library of choice, which is Tailwind. So I'm going to be using that to basically style our application. It's going to make it easy for me to just use my markup and define my styles within the markup without having the need to actually write CSS. So if you are confused with what Tailwind is, do not worry. I'm going to be showing you the step-by-step process of how to configure Tailwind with your React project. And then when we start coding our application, you'll actually see that how Tailwind is going to help us style our app. So you can actually get access to Tailwind on the website tailwindcss.com. Again, links to all of these resources down in the description. It's a utility-first CSS framework packed with different classes like Flex and padding from the top -4, text center. And what this allows us to do is basically use these classes directly within our HTML markup, as you can see, and then these classes actually style our UI. So we don't have to write any CSS by ourselves. So to get up and running with Tailwind, you can come to the Get Started section, then click on Installation and then Tailwind CLI, and then these are the steps that we have to do. Firstly, I need to do npm install -d Tailwind CSS. So let's come back to our terminal within Visual Studio Code. Let's do Control-C to exit out of the development server, and then let's run the command npm install -d space Tailwind CSS. This is going to install a dev dependency within our project that's going to be Tailwind CSS. And if you come to package.json, you can see that now a new dev dependency was added. And for those of you that are confused with what dev dependencies are and how they differ from normal dependencies, dev dependencies are just dependencies that our project depends upon during the development phase of our project. So when we deploy our app to production, then these dependencies or the code for these dependencies is not included within the final build. So now that the installation is complete, the next thing that we have to do is basically initialize Tailwind CSS. So for that, we can do npx space Tailwind CSS space init. And this is basically going to initialize Tailwind CSS and create at the root of your project a tailwind.config.js file. And this, as the name suggests, basically defines the config for Tailwind. Then within this file, we're basically going to be copying and pasting this stuff like so. And then one last thing that I'm going to be doing before I close down the Tailwind config.js file is basically come to the point where we're defining all of the different files on which Tailwind is basically going to be looking for the utility classes that we've added and generating CSS from, is to say that we also support JSX files. So just add after the JS comma JSX, do command save, and that's pretty much all we had to do. So with this done, we can close down the tailwind.config.js file, and then we can come to our index.css file and add the following Tailwind directives within it, like so, and do command save. And then finally, the last thing I have to do is come to index.js and make sure that I'm importing the index.css file. And that's pretty much all we had to do. And now Tailwind should be set up within our project. So now what I can do is basically clear npm run start again to run the development server, come back to localhost port 3000, and as you can see that the application is running on our browser again, and the styling has changed a little bit because the hello text size has decreased. So now to quickly check if everything's working as intended, what I can do is come to app.js, come to the h1 tag, add a class attribute to it, and the way we define class attributes is by using class name within JSX, and the reason for this is because class is already a reserved keyword within JavaScript, so we can't use that. So to basically define the class attribute for a element within JSX, we basically use class name, and this basically translates to class within HTML. So what I'm going to be doing is basically using a Tailwind class, which is text-5xl, do command save. And if I do this, you're going to see that automatically the changes will be applied. And now the styling for the actual hello text has changed and the size for it has increased. So this basically means the Tailwind has been configured properly. So now the next thing that we're going to be doing is importing a component library within our project so that it's very easy for us to quickly create and mock up our UI. We can just use Tailwind by itself, but it's going to be still a little bit difficult for us to create everything from scratch. So what I'm going to be doing is basically using Daisy UI, which is the most popular component library for Tailwind CSS. And this is basically going to give me access to a bunch of already created elements that I can use within my project if I'm using Tailwind. For example, if I want to add a card within my application, there's already someone who has written JSX code, which basically defines how to create a card using Daisy UI within our application. So we're just going to basically install this within our React app, and then we're going to be using this to model the UI of our application. So I've come to the point where it says install, and this is basically what we have to do. We need to make sure that Node.js and Tailwind CSS is installed, so we already have that. And after that, we just need to add the following dev dependency. So again, just copy this command, come back, Control-C to exit out of the development server. Then I will say npm-i-d Daisy UI, and then basically install it. And this is also going to be a dev dependency. Once you've installed Daisy UI, what you can do is come to the tailwind.config.js file, come to the plugin section, and basically add require Daisy UI within the list here, and do command save. And once this is done, the last thing that we're going to be doing is basically coming to the section which says themes. So Daisy UI out of the box supports a whole bunch of different themes, for example, light, dark, cupcake. So you can basically determine which one you like. I am specifically going to be using the sunset theme. So to tell Daisy UI to basically use this theme, what you have to do is basically come to, firstly, the tailwind.config.js file, and here basically define on the object Daisy UI, like so, and then this property is basically going to define the different settings or the different properties for Daisy UI. And here I'm going to set the themes property to be a list where we're just going to be supporting one theme, which is sunset, like so, and then do command save, and that's pretty much all we had to do. With this done, you can also come to the public folder index.html, and on index.html, what we're basically going to be doing is coming to the HTML tag, and then basically on the HTML tag setting the data-theme attribute equals to sunset. Do command save, and that's pretty much all we had to do. So now with this done, Daisy UI should understand what theme it needs to use, and if I do npm run start, it's going to start the development server. I can go back to the actual website running on localhost port 3000, and as you can see that the theming changed, the background is now dark, the text is a lighter gray, so that means that our theming is working now, and now we can start the actual coding process. So the first thing that I'd like to do is basically create a nav bar at the very top. And this nav bar is basically going to be the stuff that's displayed at the top, such as the actual logo for Weathermania, as well as the search bar that allows us to input location that we might want to get the weather for. So to do that, what I am going to be doing is firstly creating an actual component. The way I'm going to be doing that is coming to the source folder, new file, or new folder, I should say. I'm going to say this is going to be called components, within which I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this navbar.js. And usually the naming convention for when we create components is that their name always starts with an uppercase letter. Then I'll do enter to get into this newly created file. It's called navbar.js. And then I'm just going to be using the RFC shortcut to create a functional component and then export it out of our file. I'll call this function navbar, and then for now we'll just return some JSX, which returns a div, which is navbar. So I'll do command save, and then I'll come back to my app.js file, and I'm basically going to be using this navbar component now within the app component. So to do that, what I'll do is basically come to where I'm returning JSX for this actual component, remove the div and remove the h1 element. And now I'm going to say that we are going to add a new component here, which is going to be navbar. And the way we add components is by using a angle bracket, then the name of the component. So it's navbar. It's going to be imported from /component/navbar. And then this is going to be a self-closing tag. So I can do / and then an angle bracket, do command save. And there we go. As you can see, we can see navbar being displayed at the very top corner, as you can see. So the next thing I'd like to do now is basically update the styling for the navbar. So the way we're going to be doing this is by coming to Daisy UI, coming to the section which says menu, or navbar I should say, within the docs. So component/navbar, and here you can select any kind of navbar that you like. So I basically like this navbar. So to copy the code for this, I can come to JSX, copy this JSX, come back to app.js, then go back to the navbar.js, and then instead of returning a div now, I can return the following, do Alt-Shift-F, command save, come back to the React application that's running. And as you can see, now we have a fully functioning navbar within our application, and it's showing us a beautiful navbar. So now what I'm going to do is just quickly change some things within the actual JSX to make our app bar look the same way that it looked within the actual project that I showed you at the start of this video. So firstly, what I'm going to be doing is basically saying that we are not going to be showing Daisy UI. What we're going to be showing as the title on the navbar is Weathermania. So do that, and there we go. It's now Weathermania. Then after the actual search bar, what I want to do is basically remove this drop-down menu and the actual profile picture that we're seeing. So to do that, I can remove this div, which is drop-down and then drop-down end as its class. So one easy way to remove this div completely is to collapse it and then just remove it like so. Let's do command save, and there we go, the div was removed as well. So now we just have a search bar, and then we have our title being displayed in the navbar. And that's pretty much all I'd like to show. The next thing that I'd like to do now is basically add a footer at the bottom as well. So let's do that. So for the footer, I'll do the same thing. I'll come to components, new file. I'll say that we're going to have a footer component, so footer.jsx. Then I'm going to create the actual functional component. The name for this functional component is going to be footer. And then here for now, we'll just return the div, which has footer within it. Then I will come back to the app.js. And after the navbar, I'll say that we'll have our footer component like so. And it's going to be imported from components/navbar. So let me just say it. Import footer like so. And that's pretty much all we had to do. And do command save. So now if I come back to my application, you can see that we can see the footer here. So now what I have to do is basically come back to Daisy UI and try to find a footer here somewhere. So if I scroll through Daisy UI, it says that under layout there's footer. So let's come to footer. And then we can copy any footers that we like from here. So the one that I like is the following, which is this logo plus some copyright information and some links. So I can come to the JSX part, copy the JSX, come back to my footer.jsx, paste this JSX here, command save, come back to my application, make sure that the footer looks the way I want it to look. Everything looks good. I just want to remove the social links so I can come back to the JSX. And then basically for this nav that I have here, which is grid-flow-call as its class, I'm basically going to be removing that. Do a command save, and now our footer just contains a funky logo plus some copyright information. So that's all we had to do. The next thing that I'd like to do is basically take this footer and stick it to the bottom of my screen. So the way I'm going to be doing that is by coming to the footer, coming to the footer element, then for the class name, adding a new class here called fixed, and besides this bottom-0 and doing command save, and this will basically stick the footer to the bottom of the window and make sure that it always stays there. So that's pretty much it. Now we have a nav bar that's being displayed, and we have an actual bottom bar or a footer that's being displayed within our application. So now the next thing I'd like to do is basically create the card which is going to be displaying weather information for a city. To do that, I am going to be creating a new component, and I am basically going to be calling it weather detail. So to do that, I will say that under components, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this weather detail card, and then I'm going to say it's going to be .jsx like so. One thing I've noticed is that our nav bar is .js, not .jsx as its extension. So I'll quickly change that to be JSX and do command save. And that's pretty much all we had to do. Let's go back to our application, make sure that nothing broken. And now I can define how my weather detail card is going to look like. So here again, we're going to be returning a functional component. So I'll quickly create one, and the name for it is going to be weather detail card. And then for now, let's just return a div which says weather detail card. Then I'll do command save. I'll come back to my app.js file. And here I'm going to say that after the nav bar, but before the footer, so within them, I'm going to be adding my weather detail card component, and then it's going to be a self-closing tag like so. And if I reload my application, you can see that we have weather detail card being shown here. So now all I like to do is just fix the styling for this, make sure that the card looks pretty. So how can we do that? Well, one thing we could do is basically go to Daisy UI, try to find a card that kind of looks similar to the UI that we have in mind, and then just copy the JSX from there and paste it in. But the way that I want to develop my card, I can't find a ready-made solution here. So what I'm going to be doing is creating it from scratch using Daisy UI as well as Tailwind classes. So to do that, what I'll do is come back to weather detail card. And the first thing that we're going to be doing is basically creating a div with a class, which is going to be card like so, and do command save. And now if I come back, you can see that nothing's being shown. So we just gotta fix some other things and then it'll start to show. The next thing that I'll do is define the color on the card. So it's going to be BG neutral. So what's the background color on this card going to be? And finally, I'm going to say that it's going to have a shadow, and it's going to be shadow XL. And there we go. Now we've done that. The next thing that I'm going to be doing is basically adding something within this card. So what I will do is basically define the actual body of the card. So to do that, again, I will have a div with a class, and the class is going to be flex. And if I do command save, still our card is not being shown because we haven't added any content within it. I'm going to say that the flex direction is going to be flex call. And if you're confused with what all of these different classes are, these are just classes that come from Tailwind, and we use them to style our application. But since this tutorial is not focusing on Tailwind specifically, I won't go into much detail about these. If you want a detailed tutorial on just Tailwind by itself, then leave a comment down below this video and I'll try my best to create a video on that as well. But for now, just keep adding these classes like I am, so that your UI just looks pretty. The next thing I'm going to be saying is that space on the Y is going to be 5. And then after that, I'm going to add the card-body class and then the items center, and do command save. And there we go. Now we can see our card, as you can see, but it's taking up the complete width of our actual screen. So we'll fix that as well. And then what I can do after that is basically say that we're going to also add the text center class like so. And that's pretty much all we had to do. So now that this is done, within this div, I'm going to be adding a h2 tag. So let's do h2, and the class on that is going to be text-5xl. So there we go. Do command save, nothing's being shown. So let's add an actual text here. So for now, let's say that the location is going to be London. And if I do that, you can see that London's being shown now. So there we go. We have a card, and it's showing us London within that. Then once this is done, the next thing that I'd like to do is also change the font weight. So I'm going to say that the font is going to be bold. And now our font is bold. So now we can continue styling our card. So after I've defined this h2 tag, I'm going to have another div. And this div is going to have a class of PT, so padding from the top -4. And then what I'll do is I'll copy and paste all of the remaining classes quickly in, because I don't want to create this tutorial very long. So flex, the flex direction is flex-row, item center, and justify center. Link to the source code will be down in the description, so you don't have to worry about anything. And then within this, I'm just basically going to be adding a paragraph element, and it's going to have a class of text dash and then 6xl, like so. And then here, what I'm going to do is basically add the temperature. So I'll say that for now it's going to be 10, and then I can add degrees Celsius here. So 10 degrees Celsius, like so, and do command save. And now we can see it's showing 10 degrees Celsius. Now that this is done, I can basically go to the next step, which is to actually have another div which shows the different information regarding the humidity and things like that. So to do that, what I am going to be doing is adding another div, and this div is going to have a class of flex. So let's do that. Then for this div, what I'll do is that I'll paste the remaining classes in. So what I'm saying here is basically it's going to be a flex container. The direction will be flex row, item center, justify evenly, and then the width for this is going to be -64. And if I do that and do command save, that's pretty much all we had to do. Within this, I am basically going to be adding a div, like so. And this div is basically going to hold information regarding how cloudy the current weather is. So to get the actual icon to show clouds, what I'm going to be doing is using hero icons. So you can come to heroicons.com here. And then what I'm going to be doing here is basically saying that I want to search for clouds. There we go. We have a cloud icon. And then I'm going to say copy JSX, come back and paste this within this div, like so. Alt-Shift-F, command save, come back to the actual React project, and there we go. We're seeing this cloud icon now appearing. I just like to increase the size for this. So on the SVJ JSX code that we just copied, there's class names. We can change the width here from 6 to 10, and same here, the height from 6 to 10, and that should increase the size of the cloud, as you can see here. So the next thing that I'd like to do is that after I have this SVJ defined, I want to add a paragraph tag, and the paragraph is going to have a class which is going to be text -3xl, and then here I'm just going to say that for now it's going to be 12% cloudiness, and there we go, we're seeing 12% as well. So there we have it. That pretty much looks amazing. So now what I'll do is I'll basically copy this div that we've defined that contains our SVJ for the cloud and the actual paragraph that shows the actual cloudiness percentage, like so. And I'll just copy this div tag and all of the elements within it, paste it once more, and then paste it once more, do command save. And now we have these three different ones being displayed. So I'm just quickly going to be changing some things about them so they are a bit different. The next thing that I'd like to do is change the second one to show a icon for the wind speed. So to do that, I'll again come back to hero icons. I couldn't find a wind icon, but I could actually find a spark icon, I believe. So we're going to be using that. So let me just browse through all of these icons and try to find that spark icon that I had used. There we go, it's called Bolt. So copy the JSX for this, come back, and then what I'm going to be doing is basically coming to the second div, removing the SVG that's currently within it and pasting in the SVG that I just copied. And then once that it's done, I can come to where I have the class name and change the width and height to be 10 and 10. And then there we go, now we're showing this bold. And finally, for the actual humidity, I couldn't find an actual icon for humidity, but we'll be using this bars 3. So I'll just copy the JSX for this, come back and do the same thing for the final div that we have, remove the SVJ here, paste in the following SVJ, and then what I'll do is basically change the width here to be 10 and 10. Command save, come back to our application, so that's going to be here. And there we go, now we're seeing that we have this beautiful card appearing. It's showing London as the actual title for where the weather is being displayed for. It's also displaying me the actual temperature, and then finally the cloudiness, the actual humidity. Now the last thing that I'd like to do to fix the styling for this card is to actually wrap this within a flex div so that it gets a defined width. To do that, what I'm going to do is come to the app.jsx file, and where I have my weather detail card component being added to this app component, I am going to, before that, create a div which is going to have a class of flex. Then I'm basically going to take my weather detail card like so and place this within this div and do command save. And now that this is done, you're going to see that now our card is going to have a defined width. Once this is done, I'll add the remaining classes to this div so that our styling looks as we had intended to. So I'm going to add the flex-col class. I'm going to do items center and then justify center and do command save. And now our card should be in the center of our screen. One cool feature about using Tailwind is that our application is now going to be responsive out of the box. So if I open up the debug console and show you what this application is going to look like on a mobile phone by selecting iPhone 12 Pro, you can see that our application looks good on a mobile phone. But if we switch back to our actual browser window, you can see that it looks good on larger screen sizes as well. So this is one of the benefits for using Tailwind CSS, and it's a mobile first CSS framework. So now that this is done, the next thing that we can do is actually shift our focus from this weather detail card for now and actually take a look at our search bar and see how we can use that to, one, understand how events are handled within React, and two, understand how state is managed for components within React. So to do that, I'll come back to Visual Studio Code, close down all of the open files I have for now, and then head on over to my nav bar. On my nav bar for now, I have an input element, as you can see, and this is basically the search bar that we're seeing here. Now what I want to do is show you two things. One, how we can handle events within React, and two, how we can manage state. So let's talk about managing state first and some caveats with that, and then we'll come to event handling as well. So if you are new to React, you might think that the way you would manage state for a component is just define some kind of a variable. Let's just say var search term, and then set that equal to a string like so, or some other value. And then within your actual component, you can hook an event listener to the input, and every time an event is fired, you can update the value of the certain variable that you've defined. Well, this is not going to work. And the reason for that is because even if you update the value for this variable, it's not going to cause a re-render of the UI. So what we need to do in order to manage state within React is use a hook called useState. And I'm going to show you what useState is in more detail. But before that, you might have a question, and that is, what are hooks in React? Well, hooks are a feature of function components. They can't be used in class-based components. And they basically allow us to, as the name suggests, hook into features of React. And this could be, for example, managing the state of our application or accessing certain lifecycle functions on these function components, such as when our component gets mounted, when our component gets unmounted, things like that. So this is why we use hooks. And then there are a whole bunch of different hooks that come with React. Today, we're going to be taking a look at useState and useEffect, but there are a couple of other ones as well. And as you become proficient in React, you're going to understand what they're used for. But for now, all you need to do is understand that hooks are features that allow you to hook into the features of React and perform different operations. So what we're going to be now doing is taking a look at how we can work with the useState hook. So to use the useState hook, all you have to do is basically type in useState, and this is basically going to be imported from React, as you can see. And the useState hook is a function, and as you can see, if I hover over the definition for useState, it returns a stateful value and a function to update it. So basically, it's going to return two things to us. One is going to be a variable that gives us the current state, and then the second thing that's going to be returned to us is actually a function that we can use to update the state. So let's just say that I want to create a variable that's going to store the state of the input within our actual search field. So I'm basically going to create now two variables that I'm going to basically get by destructuring the list that gets returned to us. And the first one is going to be called search term, like so. And then the next one is going to be search term. So what's basically happening is useState is returning to us a list where the 0th index is a stateful value and the first index is a function to update that value. So we basically take the 0th index and we set that to be our search term. And then for the first index, which is a function, we set that to be setSearchTerm. So now we have the stateful value available to us within this searchTerm variable, and then we can update that using this setSearchTerm function. So now how can we hook up this actual variable with this input field that we have here? Well, to do that, we're going to be using an event handler as well as the value property on the input. So let's firstly come here and set the value property on the input. And since our search term is going to be a dynamic value, to inject dynamic values within JSX, we use two curly brackets within which we can actually add the variable that we want to add. So now if I do command save, you're going to see that nothing's going to change. But now if I come back and I just come to the useState, and here instead of setting the initial state to be an empty string, I will say London, let's just say, and do command save, you are going to see that it's showing London here, like so. So now we know that the actual search term value is being used within our input. So now the next thing that I want to do is basically set up a listener on our input so that whenever the user types something on the input field, that our actual search term gets updated. So how can I do that? Well, React has built-in event handling, and basically all events within React, you start with the on keyword. So on abort capture. And as you can see, there are a bazillion different events that you can actually listen to. The event that we are going to be concerned with is an event that is called on change. So I'm going to add that here, and then it basically expects us to give it a function that it's going to run every time something on this element changes. So now I'm basically going to be creating a function that's going to handle this. So I'll come to the top, and I'm going to say that I will create a function, and I am going to say that it's going to be called handle on change. It's going to have an event parameter passed to it, and I'll open up the function's body. And then within this function, I'll basically call the set search term function, which will basically allow us to update our search term. And then within this, I'll basically pass the value from the actual event that we get dot target dot value like so, and do command save. So now that this is done, I can come down to where I have my input and I'm defining the on change. And now I can set that to be this function. So I will do handle on change like so, and do command save, restart our application. And now you can see it's London by default. But now let's remove this initial state that we're setting and set that to be an empty string. But now if I type in Dubai, you can see that it's updating on the fly. So now that this is done, the last thing that I'd like to show you guys is basically another event handler, just to show you guys that you can use event handlers in tandem with each other. So the next thing that I want to do is basically have an event handler that's going to listen to key presses that are happening on our input field. And when the user presses enter, that I want to do is basically fire a function that submits the actual information from the search bar to wherever we want to send it, so that the weather for that place is displayed to us. So how can we do that? Well, for now, let's actually take a look at just one of the part of this whole operation, which is when we press enter, that it basically calls some kind of a function. So to do that, what I will do is basically come back, and here what I'll do is come to my import, and here I'm basically going to define a new event callback, and that is going to be on key, and then I believe it's going to be down, if I'm not mistaken. And this event is basically going to be fired every time a key down event is detected on this element. Then I will create a function, and you can also use inline functions. Just wanted to let you guys know like so. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. I just prefer to define my functions at the top of my component. That's just a preference of mine, but you can do it in whatever way you want. Then I'm going to say that it's going to be called handle key down, and it's going to have an event passed to it. Then we will come down, and on key down, I'm going to set that to be handle key down like so. And then what I'll do is within handle key down, I'll do the following. I'll say if the event dot key is equals to enter, then what I'd like to do is basically make sure that the input, or the search term I should say, is not null. And if the search term isn't null, then to the console I want to log the search term. That's pretty much what I'd like to do. And then here for useState, we can set that to be empty, so basically null. So now if I restart the application, everything looks good. If I come to the search bar and I type something in, for example, London, nothing's happening as of now. But as soon as I press enter, you can see that London gets printed to the console. So everything is working as intended. On our console, we are also actually getting an error which says that a component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controlled. So how can we fix that? Well, to fix this, all we can do is basically come to where we have our useState hook being defined. Instead of setting that the initial value to be null, it can be an empty string. And then where we check if the search term is not equal to null, now what we can do is basically say if the search term's .length is greater than 0, then we do the console log of the search term. So now if I restart my application, hopefully nothing's going to be broken and it's not going to show me the error anymore. And if I type in a value, press enter, now there are no errors being printed, and I can see Dubai being printed here. So that's great. This is excellent. And now we have implemented the functionality within our actual search bar to manage the state of it, as well as listen to certain events that are firing on our input field. So the next thing that I'd like to do is somehow create a mechanism through which I can basically update the weather detail card to show information regarding the city that I put within this search term. Well, to do that, what we have to do is somehow manage some state and somehow also get notified of certain events that happen within this component and then take action upon them. There are multiple ways of doing this, but I'm going to keep it very simple for now, and I'm going to be using this opportunity to introduce another concept to you within React, which are called props or properties. And props is a feature within React that allows us to pass data that can be variables or even functions or even components from a parent component to its child components. And that is what props are usually used for. So now what I'd like to do is basically define some state on my app.jsx component, which is going to keep track of the current location that the user wants to see the weather for. And then also implement some kind of a mechanism to update that state, and then implement some kind of a mechanism so that when we input something within this search bar, that it also updates the actual location that we're keeping a track of. So how can we do that? Well, to do that, firstly, I will come to my app.jsx file, and here I'm going to use the useState hook again. Then I'm going to say that by default, the location is going to be London, like so, and do command save. And then once this is done, I'm going to do the following. I will destructure the list get returned to us, and I'm going to say that the name of the stateful widget will be location, and the function to update will be set location, like so. So now that this is done, the next thing that I want to do is basically update the location variable when the user presses enter within the search bar once they've inputted a city name here. So how can I do that? Well, let's do this. Let's just come to our app function component and let's console log the location to start with, like so. Then let's open up the developer console within Google Chrome. You can click on the three dots that are here and then go to more tools, developer tools, or you can do Command Alt and J, and that should open the developer tools as well. And then what I'll do is I'll come to my nav bar and I will remove the console.log that's happening within handle key down. I will restart the application, or reload it, I should say. And as you can see that by default, it's going to print London. So this is basically the console.log that's happening here. So the location by default is London. So just keep a track of that for now. So now what I want to do is basically pass this function to my nav bar so that when the actual user presses enter here, it calls this function. So the way we're going to be doing this is basically by using properties. So to use properties, we do the following. We basically add an attribute to our component, doesn't matter what the name of it is. I'm going to set the name of the attribute to be the same as the actual function, so set location, and then I'm going to set that to be set location, like so. And then to access this actual property that we're passing to our actual navbar component, I can come within navbar, and where we are basically defining our function navbar, we are basically going to be taking in the props as an argument to this function. And then on this props object, I am going to have access to any of the attributes that I've defined here on the navbar component when I added it to my app component. So to access this function, all I have to do is basically do props dot and then set location. So this is the function that's going to be on the object, and then basically pass the value here that we're going to use to update our location. So the value is going to be search term, like so, and that's pretty much all we had to do. So now with this done, let's restart our application. Let's see the London's being printed. But now if I do Dubai, press enter, you're going to see that Dubai gets printed. So we're successfully updating the state from our navbar of a variable that exists on its parent component, which is the app component. So there you have it. Now you should have a better understanding of how props are used. And props are not only used for sending functions, they can be used to send data in the form of variables. We can send functions, we can send components, we can send children, and a whole bunch of other things. And as you become more proficient React developer, you'll be sending all sorts of different things to different components using props. So now that this is done, the next thing that I'd like to do is basically send the location variable that we have defined on our app component to my weather detail card, because the weather detail card is the actual component that's responsible for, you guessed it, displaying the weather information. So how can I do that? Well, we're going to be using props once again. So on my weather detail card, I'm basically going to be setting the location attribute equal to the location that we are tracking. And then on my weather detail card, now what I can do is basically come and go to the point where I have the H2 defined, that's for now showing London. And then here what I'm going to do is now access our props and then the location property on it. So on our function, we're going to have the props object passed to us. And then here, since it's going to be a dynamic value, I'm going to use curly brackets and then do props dot location, command save. And as you can see, it's now showing Dubai to me. So now that we have this done, we are finally at the step of actually accessing an external API through our React application and then getting data from it and using that data to then populate the rest of the information that's being displayed on this card, such as the temperature, the humidity, the cloudiness, as well as the wind speed. So to actually get the data for the weather, we are going to be using OpenWeather's API. And I'm going to leave a link down in the description below to OpenWeather map as well. And they are going to provide to you an API key for free. All you have to do is basically sign up to an account with them, and then you'll have access to their API key. So let me quickly sign into my account and then I will resume the video. So now that I've logged into my account on OpenWeather map, all you have to do is basically come to API keys and then basically say that I want to generate an API key and give your API key a name. So I'm going to say Weathermania as the name of my API key, and don't worry, I'll delete these ones as soon as I finish this tutorial. And then I will copy this API key, come back to my React project, and here I'm going to create a new file, which I'm going to say is going to be called const.js. And this is basically a file where I'm going to be storing some constant values within my application. Then I will do export const, and I'm going to call my variable OpenWeather API key and set that equal to the key that we had just copied. And that's pretty much all we had to do. So now we have the OpenWeather API key within our project, and we can use this when we're sending HTTP requests to actually authenticate ourselves with the API. We are now at a point within our application that we have all of these different pieces that we can now combine together to actually retrieve the weather information from OpenWeather and then display that within our weather detail card. So we are going to be doing that. To do this or accomplish this functionality, we are going to be taking a look at another hook in React that is called useEffect. And this hook is basically used to perform side effect within our React components. And as the name implies, side effects could be thought of as things that we'd like to do because of a certain effect or a certain change that happens within our application. So what I'd like to do basically is that when we actually display our weather detail card or mount that for the first time, then I'd like to go get the weather information for the actual location that we want to display the information for, and then update my UI to reflect that, while at the same time also ensure that when the location gets updated, then I refetch the weather information for the new location. To use the useEffect hook, we're basically going to be using it the same like we had used useState. All hooks in React, usually because of the naming convention we follow in React, use the word use before the actual name of the hook. So if somewhere you see use being used, that pretty much means that that's a hook that's being used within your code. So to use useEffect, it's basically going to be as follows. We firstly import useEffect from React, and then we open up the parentheses. And within these parentheses, we basically pass a function that is going to perform whatever operations we need it to perform due to a certain change that happens within our application. So the function here I'm going to define as an arrow function, and after this we add a comma and then an array, which I'm just going to leave empty for now, and then I'll explain to you what this array is. But for now, just think of this as the dependency array, as the documentation suggests that if this is present, effects will only activate in the value in the list changes. We'll come back to this, but for now, just keep following me. So now that this is done, the next thing that I'd like to do is come within the useEffect function and here basically do a console.log, and then I am going to basically say that I'm going to log the props.location. So if you remember previously, we were sending the location attribute to our weather detail card using props. So now we can access it in props.location. So now let's actually see the useEffect hook in action. So by default, if we do not give anything within our dependency array, useEffect is always going to run once when our component initially mounts. So there's no way to avoid it, and useEffect is always going to run the first time that the component gets mounted, and then whatever different variables or dependencies, I should say, that we're going to pass within this dependency array. Whenever they change, then this function is going to run as well. So useEffect is going to run the function once when the component mounts, and then subsequently every time something within our dependency array changes, and I'll come to that. So now if I come back to my React project within Google Chrome and reload it, you are going to see that London gets printed to the console. And what I can do is basically say that it's from useEffect by doing useEffect and then basically do the following. So now you're going to see that if I restart my application, it's saying useEffect and London, useEffect London. So basically this console.log is working and our function is being ran when the component mounts, as you can see. So now what I'd like to do is basically use the props.location as a value for the dependency array, so that every time the location changes, then this function is ran again. And this way we are going to be able to then fetch the new data from the OpenWeather API for the new city that we want to get the weather for. So to do that within my dependencies array, I'm going to say that we will do props.location as a dependency. And if I just do this and do command save, you are going to see that nothing's going to change initially. When I restart the application, you can see it still does London and London. And let's do this. Let's actually remove this to show you something first. And that is useEffect gets printed. But as soon as I change the location, you are seeing that useEffect isn't being ran. Even though the location did update, useEffect isn't being ran. And the reason for that is, again, because we haven't added the props.location as a dependency within our dependencies array. So let's do props.location now. And with this, reload the application. And now if I do Dubai, you're going to see that now useEffect is called again the same way that it was called when the component was initially mounted. So useEffect is a hook within React that allows us to work with side effects within our application. And as the name implies, it's basically a way for us to perform some operation due to some change that happens within our application. There is one more part about useEffect, and that is the function that's returned by useEffect, and that can be used to perform some kind of a cleanup, and that's completely optional. So a good example of that might be, and even though we're not using, I still wanted to let you know, is that if I have some kind of a WebSocket connection open with the client, let's just say this is a chat app, and I am talking with the client, and then I'm fetching these different messages, then if I want to, at the end of the day, close that connection when the user navigates away from the page, then I can basically return a function as the return value to this function, and this is basically going to be run when the component is unmounted. So hopefully that makes sense. So now that this is done, we can kind of move to actually taking a look at how we can now get data from the OpenWeather API. So to do that, we need a package that's going to allow us to perform HTTP requests. And for that, we are going to be using the Axios package. So the Axios package is a promise-based HTTP client for the browser and Node.js. So we're basically going to be using that. To install it, just copy this command, links to all of the resources down in the description, come to terminal, Control-C to exit out of the current process, and then do npm I Axios, and that's basically going to install Axios within your project. Once Axios is installed, we are ready to use it. So to use Axios, firstly, we gotta import it. So I'm going to do import Axios, like so, from Axios. And once this is done, we can actually use it. So what I'd like to do is the following. I'd like to go to a specific URL that is api.openweathermap.org, and from there, fetch the weather details. To get more information regarding the functionality that's available to you on the OpenWeatherMap API, you can come to openweathermap.org/API, browse down to where you see current weather data, and you can take a look at all of the other API endpoints that you have as well, but we are going to be getting the current weather data for a city, and then click on API doc. And specifically, we are going to be using the endpoint that allows us to give it a city name. So the first one expects us to pass it a lat and a long. We are not going to be using that. The one that we're going to be using is going to be the endpoint, which if I scroll down below, it should be here somewhere. There we go. There we go, by city name, and this is basically the endpoint that we're going to be using. So we're going to be sending a request to api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/weather, and then add some query strings to our URL to determine what the city is and what our actual API key is. So let's actually copy this URL. Let's come back to our weather detail card, and let's see how we can use Axios to perform the request. So we're going to do Axios dot, and it's going to be a get request. I am basically going to then, for the actual URL, pass a template string. So a template string is a concept in JavaScript that allows us to interpolate dynamic values within our string. And I'm going to paste in the actual URL that we had copied. Then what I'm going to do is that for the city name, instead of using what we're seeing here as the city name, we are going to embed the props.location within the string. So to do that, we are going to make sure that first we're using a template string. And then once that is done, then I'm going to do $, and then I'll open up the curly brackets. Within this, I'm going to do props.location, like so. And then for the app ID, that is going to be our API key. So if you remember, we need to import our API key. So I'm going to do, again, $, and then open weather underscore API underscore key, like so. And we need to import this from our consts file. So to do that, I will come to the top of my actual file. And here I am going to do import open weather API key from /const, like so. So now that this is done, we are basically going to wait for this operation to complete. And once it completes, then basically update some information. So to do that, what I'll do is basically tack onto this promise a then clause. So basically when this completes, what would I like to do? So I'm going to get a result passed to me, and then I can do whatever I want within this arrow function. And then besides this, another thing that I'd like to do is tack on a catch clause as well. So in the case that we get some kind of an error, I want to run the following function. And for now, both of these can be empty. So let's take a look at firstly the then clause and what happens when we actually get the data successfully, and then we'll look at the catch clause as well. So let's go back to our React application within the browser. Let's reload it. It's not working because we aren't running it, and do npm run start. And hopefully the application spins up and the development server starts running and our application reloads. There we go. So now it's showing us the current weather card. So now within the then clause, I'd basically like to save our result that we get from the API within a variable. So basically within some state. How can I do that? Well, to do that, we're basically going to be using useState once again. So let's do that. So I'm going to basically at the top create a useState hook. I'm going to say that by default, we are not going to have any weather data, so it'll be null. Then I will destructure the array that gets returned to me, and the stateful value will be called weather. The function to update will be setWeather, and then I'll set this equal to useState, like so. Once this is done, I will come back to Axios, to the then clause, and here I am going to do the following. I'm going to do setWeather to the result that gets passed to us, and that's pretty much all we are going to be doing, and do command save. Now with this done, let's restart our application, and we are getting no errors. One more thing I can do is just console log the result to the console to just at least affirm that we are getting a result. So there we go. Now that's done. And one thing I'd like to do is not set it to result, but result.data. And here it's the same, it needs to be result.data. And now if I restart my application or reload it, you're going to see that there we go. We are getting the data object being printed to our console, and we can see all of the different information that's been returned to us from the API. If you want to see a detailed explanation of what the actual response from the API is, again, you can come to openweathermap.org, come to the current weather data API docs, and here you can see what a sample response looks like. So we're going to get an object returned to us which has these different properties such as coordinates, weathers, main, and that contains different information. So we're going to be using some of these to populate the information that's being displayed within our card. So now that we have access to the data and we've said that within this weather variable, we can basically use this to display that information. So how can we do that? Well, let's quickly come down and let's see where we have to change things. So firstly, what I want to do is change this paragraph tag to show the current temperature. So to do that, I will basically use curly brackets within which I'll do weather.main.temp, and then I'm going to do command save. And let's see, yep, it's showing me the temperature now, but I want the temperature to not have any decimal value. So I'm going to do toFixed, and then I will say 0. And this will make sure that no decimal values are shown for the actual temperature. It's a whole number. And then I'll also add a space between the number and the actual degree Celsius sign. There we go. The next thing that I'd like to do is now update the cloudiness value. So to do that, I'd firstly got to find where I am showing the cloudiness value. So it's here. And then I basically need to make sure that now this is actually referring the information from the weather variable. So weather.clouds.all. And then if we come back, there we go. It's saying that it's 100% cloudy right now. Don't want to be in London right now, I guess. Then once this is done, we are going to be accessing the weather speed. So that's going to be the next div, and within that our paragraph tag. And then here I am going to do weather.wind.speed and do toFixed as well, because I don't want the speed to be in decimals as well. And then space meter per second, because the value is going to be in meters per second. But suddenly I realized that the actual values that we are getting are not using the correct unit system that I want to use. So let's quickly fix that. To fix that, what I'm going to do is basically go to the very top to where we are actually sending our request within useEffect to the OpenWeather API. And here for the query string, or the query parameters, I should say, I'm going to add another parameter after the API key. And I'm going to say that this is going to be the units, and I want the information to be returned to me in metric units. And if I do this, restart my application, reload it, and now it's giving me an error. And the reason we're getting this error is because it's saying that it cannot read properties of null. So the reason for this is because by default, weather is going to be null. And it's going to take some time for Axios to actually go fetch the information, then call the then clause so that we update the weather. So in that time, we can't access the information that we're trying to access on our weather object. So what we need to do is basically implement some kind of a mechanism to not display this information when we don't have it. So a way we could do this is by using conditional rendering, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So to do this, I'll do the following. I'll come to the div, which contains our temperature information from the weather, and above that, I am going to add a React fragment. Then I'll copy the ending closing tag for this React fragment and come to the very bottom and then add it here like so, and do Alt-Shift-F Command save. Now that this is done, if I collapse this empty fragment, you are going to see that if the fragment gets collapsed, then the only thing that we're going to basically show to the user within our card is going to be the location for the actual place that we want to get the information for. The rest of the information I do not want to show if weather is null. So now what I'm going to be doing is basically using conditional rendering, and the way we'll do this is by using a curly bracket and then basically defining a condition. So I'm going to say that if the weather is not equals to null, then we will return the React fragment and then all of the stuff within it, and then I'll come at the very bottom and after the React fragment add the closing curly bracket. And by doing things this way, we will ensure that when weather is not null, only then is this certain JSX returned. So now if I do Command save, hopefully the error should be fixed, as you can see. And for some time, you see that the card doesn't display anything. And then once we get the information, it displays it. So everything's working as intended. So now we have the actual wind speed being displayed to us as well. So the last thing I'd like to do is basically show the humidity. So to do that, I'll come to our last div, and here I am going to do weather.main.humidity.toFixed 0, and then I will also say that this is also going to be a percentage value. So there we go, humidity is 83%. Since we have useEffect already configured and to its dependencies array, we've passed our props.location. So every time we update the location within our search bar, then hopefully this actual information should change as well that's being displayed in the card. So let's test it. Let's type in an actual city. Let's do Mumbai. Press enter, and there you go. It updates the card detail, and now we're seeing the weather for Mumbai. It's saying that it's 28 degrees Celsius there. It's 3% cloudiness, 2 meters per second the wind speed, and 61% humidity. So everything looks great. I'll remove the console log statement from the setWeather function now, and let's see, everything looks great. So now one thing I'd like to do is that when we are actually loading information, I'd like to show a loading spinner within my actual weather detail card. So how can we do that? Well, firstly, we got to maintain some state so that we can determine if we are currently loading information or not. So to do that, I will again use useState to create a variable that can keep a track of that for me. So I'll do const, say loading, the function to update loading will be set loading. and then use useState, and then I will say that by default, we are not going to be loading anything. Now that this is done, when we actually start the operation within useEffect, what I am going to do is basically say that we're going to set loading to true, like so. And within then, I will say that we'll set loading to false, like so. And in the case we catch an error, then what I'd like to do is also set loading to false. So if you get an error, that pretty much means that we concluded the operation, but we don't have the data. And now that this is done, what I can do is basically come down, and after my h2 tag, which basically shows the location, I am going to say that if we are loading, then I'd like to basically display the following. And that is going to be a span. And this again comes from the actual component library that we are using, which is Daisy UI. So you can come to Daisy UI, and here you can try to find loading within feedback, and you can copy any loading indicator that you like. So I like the spinny one, so I'll come to JSX, and it's the last one here. So I'll copy the actual JSX for it and then paste that here like so, and do command save. So with this done, that's pretty much all we had to do. So now when loading is true, only then will this actual JSX be returned. So if I come back, reload the app, there we go. You see that for that split second, that loading indicator is shown. So it looks great. It's working as intended. One last thing I'd like to implement is basic error handling. And the reason I'd like to implement that is because we don't have any kind of safety on our input field in terms of what we can actually give to it as a name of a city. And if we get some random gibberish within this input field and that city doesn't exist, then we won't get any information for that. For example, I can say XYZ, press enter, and there you go. You get an error saying 404 not found. So we have to handle this as well. So how can we handle it? Well, to handle it, again, I need to firstly create a variable that can manage some state for me so that I know if there is an error or not. So let's quickly use useState to achieve this. And I'm going to say it's going to be error set error and do useState. And by default, the error is also going to be null. By default, we're not going to have any error. And when any errors occur, then we will get them. And instead of doing null, let's do false. That by default, we won't have any error. So let's do false. Then when we actually start the operation of fetching information, I'll set error to false. And then within the actual catch block, I will say that we will set loading to false and set error to true. There we go. That looks great. Once this is done, the next thing that I'd like to do is basically update the actual logic for conditionally rendering information within our card for the weather. So now I'd like to do three things. Firstly, I'd like to ensure that we're not loading. So to do that, I'll say if we're not loading and the error is false and the weather is not null, then we want to display the weather information. So let's test this out. There we go. And now everything looks good. So now I can come to the part of error handling. To handle the error, all I'll do is basically, in the case that we get an error returned to us, we basically display within our card that we were unable to load data. So to do that, after the actual loading indicator, I am going to say that if we're not loading and we have an error, then we will return the following JSX, and it'll just be a paragraph tag like so. And this paragraph tag is going to have a class name of text-large, and within this I am basically going to say that we were unable to load the data. There we go. So now with this done, let's do command save. Let's come back. Let's reload our application. Everything looks good. If I type in XYZ, press enter, there we go. It tells us that it's unable to load the data for this place. If I change this to Dubai, there we go. Now it lets me know that we were able to get the data for this location. So everything looks great. So now we've implemented proper data fetching. We know how useEffect works. We have good experience with useState. We're dynamically updating the UI. So hopefully you're learning a lot in this video, and if you are, then please don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe to my channel so that you get notified every time I release a new video. So now the last thing I'd like to do is basically implement the functionality within my application so that at the bottom of my web page, it basically shows me weather for all of the previous locations that I had previously searched for. So to do that, we will come to our app.js file, and firstly we got to create some kind of state that can help us maintain this information about the locations that we've previously searched for. So to do that, I will say that I'll be using useState again. I'm going to have a history array. It's going to be set history, and then I'll use useState and set that to be an empty array to begin with. So begin with, we don't have any history. Once this is done, the next thing that I am going to be doing is creating a function, and this function is going to be called update location. And it's basically going to get a location string passed to it. Within this function, I am going to call set location, and then basically set that to the location that gets passed to us like so. And this needs to be new location as the actual parameter that gets passed to this function. Otherwise, things might not work as intended because we also have a state variable called location. Then on the nav bar where I'm setting the set location prop, I'm going to say that now we're not going to pass it the set location function, but a reference to our update location function. And hopefully everything should work as intended for now. So let's just quickly reload our application. Yes, and everything looks good. So we can just reload it again. Within the update location, besides updating the location variable, I'd also like to add to our history this location. So to do that, I will do set history. And this function, which is our set state function for useState, you could think of, can also take a function as an argument. And this function gets passed to it the previous value of our state. So I will say that this is going to be previous. And then we can do whatever we want within this function. What I'm going to do with this function is basically return a new list, which is going to contain the location that was just given to us, and then all of the previous entries in the history array that we already had. And I'm going to do that by using the spread operator, as you can see. And the reason we're doing this is because state needs to be updated in an immutable manner within React. So let's test this out to see that if things are actually working the way we want them to work. So I will add a console.log statement, and I will say that I want to console.log history. Then I will come back, reload my application, and in the console you can see that by default we have an empty array. If I type in Dubai, then London should be added to the history list. There we go, so London was added. So now that this is done, what we can do is move on to the next step, which is to display this information. So to display this information, I'm going to be creating a component. So let's come to our components, new file, and I'm going to say that this is going to be called history.jsx. Then I will create a React functional component, and it's going to be called history like so. Once this is done, I'm going to remove the import from React, come back to my app.jsx file, and here, after the div that I've defined, which contains my weather detail card, and before my footer, I'm going to add my history component, like so, and do command save, and it's giving me an error saying history is not defined. So we just gotta import it. So I'll come to the top, and I'll say import history from, and then /components/history. There we go, that fixes the issue for us. Let's come back, let's see. Yes, we are seeing history being displayed to us. So now let's just quickly fix the styling for the actual component. So I'll close down all of the files, come to where I have my history component, and we are going to be doing the following. Firstly, I'll set the div to not have anything within it. Then I'll set the class name on the div to be margin x-3. Within this, I am going to have an h2 tag, and this h2 tag is going to have a class which is going to be text-3xl and font-bold, and it's going to be called, or history I should say. Let's come back, let's see how it looks. Looks great, so we can continue moving forwards. Then I'll have a div, and this div will have a class of grid, and these are just Tailwind classes. Then I will say that the grid is going to have call 1 if we're on our mobile phone, and for screen sizes that are medium sized or above, we are going to have grid dash calls dash 3. So I'm just basically adding these utility classes that come from Tailwind to make sure that my UI is responsive on small or big screen sizes. And then finally, I'm going to say that on medium screen sizes and above, I'd like the space on the x-axis to be 5 and do command save. So there we have it. That is working as intended. If I reload my app, everything looks good. History is being displayed to me. For now, it's an empty list. So now what I'd like to do is basically pass the history array to my history component using props. So I am going to come back to app.jsx because this is where we're maintaining our history. I'll come to where my history component is, and I'm going to say that history is going to be equal to the history. Then when this is done, I will come back to history.jsx and basically say that this functional component will get props passed to it. And then here we can basically use those props. So what I'd like to do is basically loop through all of the elements within the locations array that gets passed to us using the properties object. And then for each of them, we can render a weather detail card, which we already have. So that's the benefit of using components. So to do that, or to map over a list or an array within React and then return some JSX for that, what we do is basically use these curly brackets within which we do props dot location. So this is our actual array dot map. So I want to loop over all of the entries that are within my location array, and I want to transform each of them. So I'll get these location elements given to me, and for each of them I'd like to return my weather detail card. So weather detail card, like so. And there we have it. That's pretty much all we have to do. And then what I'll do is for my weather detail card, I will import it. So I'll come to the top and I'm going to say import weather detail card from /weather detail card. There we go. So now if I do command save, everything should be working. It needs to be weather detail card as well. Restart my application. Everything seems to be working as intended, except for the fact that it's saying that it can't read property of undefined on map. So what's the reason for that? So let's come back to our code, and it needs to be props.history, not props.location. So props.history. And then if I restart my application, everything looks great. So now if I come here and I add Dubai here, you're going to see that by default, it says Dubai is now being shown here, but for London, we're not seeing that information, even though we're adding London to our history. And the reason for that is because to my weather detail card, I need to pass it the location. So do that, I'll set the location prop on the weather detail card to be equal to the location that gets given to us within this map function. So with this done, you can see that now the history is being displayed to us. So now let's restart our application. Everything looks great. If I add, let's do New York now. And if I press enter, there we go. It's showing me the current information about New York. And down below, it's showing me London. One thing that you'll see in the console is that it's telling me that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So basically, when we are rendering a list of elements within React, each of those elements need to be given a unique key property so that React knows how to render them properly and also how to reflect changes in the UI properly. So on our weather detail card, we basically need to define a key prop, and we need to set it to some unique value that's going to be unique for each of the actual elements. So what I'll do is basically set the location to be the key, but this is not the recommended way because a user might input the same location twice. And if that's the case, then this key is not going to be unique. But if we make the assumption that by default, user will never enter the same location twice, then this key should suffice. So if I do command save now, reload my application, the error should be gone. If I type in a city name, for example, let's just do Abu Dhabi, you can see that now we're not getting the error printed anymore to our console. So everything looks good now. Now I can come back and test it once more. So I can say, besides Abu Dhabi, I'd also like to view the weather for, let's just do an easy city. So Hong Kong could be a good place to check the weather for. There you go. It's saying that in Hong Kong, it's 27 degrees centigrade. Abu Dhabi, it's 24. London, it's 7 degrees Celsius. So now everything looks great. And because we were using Tailwind, if I actually show you my website on the phone or our app on the phone, you can see that it looks great on there as well. One thing I can see here is that on phone, the spacing between these cards isn't nice. So what I'll do is say that by default, the space on the Y will be 2. And if I do this, it should pretty much fix the issue for us. There we go. I'd like to increase the spacing a bit more. So let's do space on the Y be 4. And now the spacing looks absolutely great. One last thing I'd like to do is come to this H2 tag history, and I'm going to say that it's going to have margin top 2, margin bottom 2 as well. So instead of this, we can just do margin Y2. This will add just some spacing between the history and these cards. So everything looks great. So with that, that concludes the tutorial for today. I hope that you enjoyed the video and learned a thing or two about React. I tried my best to give you a thorough understanding of all of the fundamental concepts of React. And by now you should feel confident. There's still a lot more that you have to learn. And if you have questions regarding certain topics, then feel free to leave them down in the comments below. And if you'd like me to create tutorials on certain topics, also leave that in the comments below and I'll try my best to do that for you. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, keep learning, keep going, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.